What we got here is failure to communicate, a chronic neglect of military mental health care. This is Psychiatric Casualties, how and why the military ignores the full cost of war.
Hey, everybody, welcome. I'm Charles Figley. Mark Russell is with us, and we're talking today, like we normally do, about military mental health and what a mess we have. But what we're doing is attempting to deconstruct this mess and to explain it in as logical and direct terms as possible. But it's something that both of us have cared about deeply. And Mark and I wrote a book. I'm not even going to talk about the title because I'm not promoting the book, right? Mark, what do you think?
Yeah. So what do I think? I think it's I find it very difficult, to say the least, very challenging to try to condense everything like in this one chapter, which really is a very concise chronological history of traumatic stress, war stress, and the whole trauma pension wars and everything else that leads up to today's current views about what we perceive as legitimate or illegitimate consequences of warfare or exposure to trauma. So it's to me, it's always very difficult to try to pick out one or two items that to focus on when I feel like there's that history is so rich and so important to learn, and heeding to George Santa Anna's, famous saying that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And so I probably go a little too far in the weeds when it comes to history, but it's always been interesting to know that what we're dealing with in today's society, today's military, is no really different than what they dealt with, back in the American Civil War and earlier. So we'll have a lot to talk more about that in this episode.
Okay, good. Well, one first thing we're going to be talking about is the section in the book in which we address, it's 40 to 45 pages, so it's quite a bit, but of World War II and relearning the realities of modern war.
Yeah.
And we were just in a point, as a country in which we thought we got it. Okay, we understand this. We have experiences from another world war. And so we're going to develop all kinds of measures and all kinds of strategies for being able to eliminate, if not reduce significantly. And just the opposite happened, as we talked about last time, which in the table 1.1,
right,
we had a mortality rate during World War I, 21%, but it jumped to 30% in World War II, and stabilized kind of with the Korean War, 25%, more or less. But it's that kind of relearning. But you pointed out, yes, I co-authored the book, but you have pointed out on numbers of conversations, et cetera, that it doesn't have to be that way, didn't need to be that way. And that's one of the reasons why we're probably doing this now. Mark?
No, thank you, John. But yeah, so that chart, the mortality rate, again, highlights the importance of learning our hard-fought battlefield lessons. In this case, it was the lessons of medicine and to improve survivability in the war zone. But when it comes to psychiatric lessons of war, I want to read you just a very brief excerpt coming from 1914, again, out of the First World War. This is from the famous German neurologist Hermann Oppenheim, who coined the term traumatic neurosis that we talked about last episode. And this is what he said is the psychiatric lesson of the First World War and the wars before that. The war has taught us, it will continue to teach us, that just as before, there are traumatic neuroses, that they are not always covered by the concept of hysteria. and that they really are the product of trauma and are not goal-oriented, well-cultivated pseudo-illness. Very profound statement, and framing that part of the trauma pension debate that says that most people's responses after traumatic stress exposure, whether in the private sector or through war, are legitimate forms of suffering, and that involve changes to how the brain is functioning. And that is the concept of traumatic neurosis. And then shell shock was adopted as a war manifestation of that. And that it's not covered as a hysteria, which is the other side of that trauma pension debate, is that it's all due to predisposition, predisposed weakness, personality, and or greed, wanting a paycheck. And that Oppenheim really does frame both sides of that trauma pension debate. That as we go into the Second World War, every warring power had made concerted efforts to like you said, how do we stamp out the psychiatric problem? How do we resolve the mental health dilemma in the military? So let's say that after the First World War concluded in 1918, there were a lot of large medical conferences and military conferences about the psychiatric problem, and they had all these experts testifying from throughout the world come together and talked about what led to this epidemic in psychiatric casualties that every warring power experienced. And what they concluded was that it was due to, again, the weakness of society, modern society. It had to do with offering people pensions, compensation that led to the initial evacuation syndromes. It had to do to poor leadership, poor training, and also the corrosive influence of psychiatry or medicine, that they were giving people labels that made people think that they actually had an injury, and that led to their being removed from the front lines. Everything concluded was, except the fact that modern warfare had proven to be especially toxic, and that the threats now came from the sea, came from under the sea, it came from the air you breathe. It came from long-range artillery, rapid machine gun fires, all the technology of warfare, including tanks and all the other high-level explosives. That didn't get factored in at all as to explaining this epidemic and warfare casualty. So, as a consequence, you had countries like Germany that outlawed the use of psychiatric terms, and leading up to the Second World War. All the military powers, including the United States, disbanded their psychiatric programs, again, trying to remove that corrosive influence of mental health providers. They eliminated all that frontline psychiatry. They took all the psychiatrists out of the military, kicked them out, and they screened out in the most robust mass screening of any type of psychiatric predispositions ever undertaken. And we'll talk more about this in future episodes. But the bottom line is, for the US military, we screened out almost 2 million Americans from entering the military due to some predisposed risk factor, like if their parents had divorced, if they stammered or stuttered when they were kids, if their ears were asymmetrical. I mean, any conceivable risk factor, they were removed from entering the military. So that was the posture of not just the American, but again, all the European powers, as well as they entered the Second World War.
So all of this happened when we had full confidence that we'll be able to control all the problems that we needed psychiatry for.
Yeah. So basically what happened after the First World War, and all these post-war analysis were done, is they concluded that the problem was mass hysteria, that these were not real illnesses, and that we needed to get rid of the roots of that hysteria, which are get rid of the weak people from joining the military, and the weak predisposed people, and then also get rid of the influence of medicine and psychiatry in particular. so that what we are left with is a very hardy, resilient fighting force that's immune from these environmental factors that they attributed their epidemics and psychiatric casualties to, as opposed
That
to
was the
warfare
plan.
itself. That was the plan. How did it go?
Not well.
Well, for the Americans, I'll stick to the American side. The psychiatric casualties in the first year of war outnumbered the number of new recruits, that is, that came in the war. So all those people who were screened out from being in the military, and all you're left with is a bunch of Captain Americas, really, the most resilient, psychologically hardy fighting force ever put together. I mean, they were psychologically tested to the nth degree. And these were all people who were shown to have no predispositions, weakness, or pre-existing personality problems, and were not morally corrupt. Yet, however, psychiatric casualties outstripped the number of recruits, leading to them, the U.S. military, having to backtrack in 1942 and said, we're going to get rid of this policy now, mass screening out and rejecting people. And they brought back American mental health providers, psychiatry, psychologists, social workers, and they reinstituted their frontline psychiatry policies that were adopted in the First World War.
Now that for World War II, that was kind of in the middle of the war, right? It wasn't toward the end. It was what, 1942 or something?
Yeah, so that was the second year of the American involvement in the war, and of course the war in Europe started in 1939 for the Second World War. But every warring power was faced the same problem in the Second World War, which was psychiatric casualties now were approximating or outnumbering the number of physically wounded or killed in action. And so that whole issue that they thought they settled after the First World War, because they misread history, they misread the legitimacy of traumatic stress injuries and the effect of modern warfare has on the human mind and the human body. That lesson was relearned a dozenfold in the Second World War.
So in effect, Oppenheim was correct.
Oppenheim was absolutely correct.
Yeah. And it was at a time in which there was agreement, et cetera, but then something happened.
Yeah.
What the heck happened?
Well, then the Second World War happened after the First World War concluded, right? And they did their post-war analysis, and they concluded wrongly that it had nothing to do with the effects of modern warfare. It all had to do with the individual weakness and, and lack of unit training and, other variables. But so what happened with the paradigm, again, the paradigm after 1916 was that it was pseudo illness. It was traumatic hysteria, that these were no longer legitimate injuries of the brain or the body or the mind, that these were all pseudo fake illnesses or hysteria. In the Second World War, when they changed their policies to let psychiatrists back in and they reinstituted the frontline policies, et cetera, they adopted a modified paradigm, which said this, that acute stress injuries are authentic, real injuries, just as equated with physical injury.
Mm-hmm.
And that every human being has a limit in terms of how long they can tolerate that exposure to extreme stress or traumatic stressors of war or in general. So they changed the paradigm that there's universal acceptance that every human being can break down in the face of extreme stresses, and that's to be predicted, but that these breakdowns are short-lived, and they typically, say that within a few weeks or months that those problems should resolve, and that anyone who had any longer lasting symptoms, then that's a manifestation of hysteria, and those are the people who are looking to malinger or to get out of combat or to get a paycheck or something, a disability paycheck. So they did modify the paradigm. They said, okay, we accept the fact that it's universally wide humans are vulnerable to being in those types of environments, but that it's limited to these very transient short-lived acute stress reactions. Anything beyond that, lasting more than several months, up to 6 months, is now we're talking about personality disorder. We're talking about predisposed weakness, and that's where we're at today. That policy, that modified traumatic neurosis policy, where they kind of split it and says some parts of that are legitimate injuries, the initial injury, these acute injuries are real, but anything longer than that are fake, essentially, or hysteria. That is the exact paradigm we have today. It's just worded differently than I said it, but it boils down to that same effect, that we still have a paradigm in today of traumatic hysteria, and there's still this ongoing debate and controversy about whether PTSD is legitimate, and whether that is a socially manufactured condition from anti-war psychiatrists who pushed this on to the medical field, this concept of PTSD.
Mark, can I ask you about your experiences today, actually, with going through these medical records and making determinations?
Yeah, so I do, VA kind of disability exams and looking through the records and I'm interviewing people who are still on active duty, as well as those who just got out, and people all the way from the Korean War. I still am seeing people from that other wars as well. But the modern day, in today's military, they're dealing with the same issues around mental health stigma, about the whole construct of weakness, predisposed weakness, and not want to be labeled with a mental health condition like PTSD because it conveys weakness, and all that is unchanged. So the issues, again, some of the vernacular, the wording has changed. There's a lot more lip service in the military today about acknowledging that, psychological wounds of war are legitimate, or people should seek mental health, but then there's the weaponization of stigma still exists today, and we'll talk about that in later episodes. But yeah, folks, I feel a lot more empathy, if anything, that like things haven't changed in my day in the military. They haven't changed in your day of the military. We have perpetuated this. We have not learned our psychiatric lessons of war. So the psychiatric mortality charts would be relatively flat. They'd be unchanged, generally, from the time of the First World War up until now. We still are repeating the same mistakes.
One of the things that occurs to me is that there's this constant rotation, right, within the military.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, one way or the other, eventually.
Deployment rotations?
Deployment, but I'm thinking more of how change of command does not carry on what was determined, and there is this rotation always.
Yeah, I think that contributes a little to the diffusion of responsibility in the military, that that people do rotate out. The civilian leaders of the heads of military medicine are usually civilian. They're at the deputy assistant, whatever, Department of Defense. So they rotate out, and so there's not that continuity. But I'll tell you where we could have, in the American Civil War, if I might, there was a Surgeon General named William Hammond who adopted what he called a mind-body unitary theory that he put into action. In 1862, he developed a specialized hospital, the U.S. Army Hospital for nervous diseases. It was called Turner Lane in Philadelphia. And this was the first ever in the world hospital its mission was to research and treat war stress injuries back in the American Civil War. In fact, the very first clinical trials of what we would call PTSD was conducted by Jacob da Costa at Turner Lane, and was published in, I think, 1863 during the American Civil War, where he treated, I think, 200 or so Union soldiers who developed what they call an irritable heart, which is a type of shell shock, traumatic neurosis condition. But anyways, from that Surgeon General and not everybody in the Union Army medical and the Union Army in particular accepted this paradigm that these traumatic neurosis are legitimate injuries and should be equated to physical injuries. But that Surgeon General had the right policies, and he put that program. But as soon as the American Civil War ended, that research part of that innovative part of a dedicated treatment and research center for war stress injuries evaporated. That mission went away, and it just became a hospital for the insane, so to speak. But if we had continued that policy, or if the First World War in 1916, if we had maintained traumatic neurosis as the dominant paradigm, that psychological injuries are the same as physical injuries, essentially. It's legitimate. We ought to treat it seriously. We ought to prepare for it. We're obligated to treat and to intervene where we can. Where would we be today in the field of mental health care and society if that had been the adopted paradigm that continued? Where would we have with mental health stigma today? It would be almost non-existent, or it would be an outlier if people thought differently, right? So the lack of continuity, like you're saying, due to military leadership, it does add to the problem when people who do believe in the value of the holistic paradigm of treating mental health on par with physical health, when they're no longer in office, somebody else comes in and upends the apple cart.
One of the things that I was also going to talk about, I mentioned briefly last time, was U.S. Army Captain Frederick Hansen. Do you want to talk about that experience that he had?
Yeah, so what Hansen was doing, this was in North Africa when the American military first got into the Second World War. We took on North Africa as our first venture. It was the largest, at that time, the largest amphibious landing ever conducted. And in Tunisia, Hansen and his group were part of that new cadre of psychiatrists that the Army brought in once it reversed its faulty mass screening policies and, in rooting out psychiatry. So they brought back in the psychiatrists. And it was Hansen's, who was a neurologist, actually, he did that initial study, basically adopting the First World War's frontline policies and implementing it there. And that's where he talked about his study. I think it was 30% return to duty or 40% or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so that led to the American military establishment to say, okay, let's start doing this widespread again, and we'll start implementing this frontline policy.
Yeah, apparently he was able to return to duty, all of these folks in 30 hours. It's not like it's after a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and then other people started, reporting on their particular experiences with frontline psychiatry, and it was return to duty rates of 70%, 80%, even 90%. And the people at the headquarters in the Pentagon started questioning some of these statistics because they were still seeing more psychiatric casualties coming out of the war zones, coming back home. And if we were returning to duty, all these people, why are we still having this large attrition rate? Right. So they did some classified investigations into the frontline psychiatry programs. And one of the this was secret until they removed the secret finding, but I got my hands on it. And what these two colonels, I think it was Grinker and Siegel, were the two Army colonels that did this study for the Pentagon. Yeah. And what they found was that actually, I think they said less than 1 to 2% of these soldiers, Marines, whatnot, who were repeatedly returned to the front lines after breaking down, less than 1 or 2% were actually fit for full duty. And this was in a secret classification report but that was because they did that again because there was skepticism about people over-reporting the efficacy of this policy of repeatedly returning nervous soldiers, individuals who had broken down in combat and returning them back to the front lines, that they had real questions about that, the efficacy of that.
Yeah, you were talking earlier on about how various programs that seemed to work were faded away after wars.
Always.
Start over again.
Everyone, that's right. So, that's from our research, right? That there's a generational pattern that after the wars end, all these new programs and all the lessons learned for managing psychiatric problems, or managing the mental dilemma, all fade away very quickly. And that's what we're seeing today too. I'm sorry I cut you off.
And it's already starting.
It already has.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We see it in spades.
What's that?
Once the bullets stop flying, those programs dry up very quick. Why? Because the military doesn't really fully believe that one, they're responsible for treating war stress injuries, and that by offering these programs, there is a large suspicion or skepticism that what we're doing is reinforcing weakness in the ranks. And so they kind of go into this half-hearted, that it will appease the politicians. Maybe some leaders believe it's the right thing to do, but there is a large bureaucratic organization there that looks at the primary mission of the military is to fight and win wars. Military medicine and psychiatry is to force, protect, and maintain that fighting force. And they believe that second mission sometimes interferes with the first mission, and that we coddle people too much. We're giving people too many ways off the front line, and psychiatry is the primary culprit in that.
And at the same time, we haven't really come to terms with how horrible and terrible combat is, and how natural and normal it is to be afraid and to grit your teeth at the very least.
I mean, my God, I've actually read the studies that were done in the UK after the First World War, and the investigations into shell shock. Like I alluded to that earlier, and it is appalling the extent that these experts in the military, medical experts, psychiatric experts, the extent that most of them went to blame everyone and anything other than the war itself. That modern warfare is at a level of technology where the technology is not designed as much to kill, it's designed to frighten. It's designed to demoralize the other force. And it's highly effective. And more so now in today's modern warfare and technology than ever before, with all the use of drones and other tactics and techniques and so on. But no, the studies do very rarely point the finger at the war itself and the toxic levels of stress exposures on modern battlefields. And it's all about the individual weakness and the lack of that stiff upper lip and the coddling, corrosive influence of psychiatry and weakening of society. That's what a lot of these experts point to. It's demoralizing to hear that these are the leaders.
Yeah.
They can't even acknowledge that the war itself has some major part to do with why people who are otherwise very resilient and hardy and strong succumb to these war stress injuries.
Yeah, very much so. Let me go to the next one. And this is, the Vietnam War. And it just as a brief startup here, among the 8.5 million who served in Vietnam, 1964 to 1973 is the cutoff.
That's right.
Yeah. I was there in 65, so there wasn't very many people there when we arrived.
Right.
We landed in Phu-Bai. Well, not landed, but a ship came into Phu-Bai, and we disembarked there. And they drove us out to, well, as it turned out, where we went, at least the Marines went, was at an Army installation about 20 clicks away from Hue. But we only stayed there briefly, just mentioning this briefly. And then I was assigned, I was to take 5 men not back, but to a new place that our company was moving toward. We were moving from Da Nang to Chulai, which is south of Da Nang. But it was surreal because you had really no enemy that I could see or we could sense.
Mhm.
And that everyone seemed very happy. The locals, etc. I mean, the VC hadn't really penetrated in this to the south,
Right,
but
before Tet, right? So,
oh yeah, 68.
very
That's
different.
when everything started crashing through.
Yeah.
But the leaders credit frontline psychiatry for low rates and war stress casualties. Yet the congressional committee that was formed, I can't remember exactly the year, maybe 83 or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Is that right? Okay.
I think so.
Yeah, so the PTSD among 30% of the combat deaths at the time. So Mark remarked about no military research has been conducted that compared outcomes of frontline psychiatry, RTD, with psychiatric evacuation and treatments.
Yeah, well, that's been the repeated theme throughout. Since the frontline policies, psychiatry policies were adopted, there's been really no interest to actually research it, because when the military has researched it in that secret report I said, the
They don't
conclusions
like the
were,
answers.
conclusions were not very favorable for it. And they weren't prepared to get rid of it altogether, because that's what they did after the First World War. And they found that the lack of psychiatry and those programs were devastating, to promulgate the war in the Second World War. So you go to Vietnam, and they seem to have learned that lesson. They kept forward psychiatry policies intact, and they deployed Army psychiatrists and psychologists, etc., to the front lines. And they were reporting, very extremely low rates, like 1%, 2% of psychiatric casualties during the Vietnam War. And they declared, basically, I remember there was a New York Times article that came out around that same time period, where they quoted Army psychiatrists and Army leaders as saying that they have stamped out, I'm using my words, but they literally had stamped out the issue of psychiatric casualties in war. And they stamped out that problem. They ended the epidemic, right? They solved the mental health dilemma by putting all these resources in there, and that prevented people from being evacuated from the front lines after an emotional breakdown, and sending them back and back and back again. And that was the lore for a good amount of time. But then there was a lot of skepticism, as you know, when people got back, like yourself, from Vietnam, and this is way before we had PTSD. But the suicide rates were extraordinarily high, and people were going to psychiatric hospitals at high rates, and what was called then Vietnam War Syndrome, as you wrote about. And they did that study, and I think it was like in the mid 1980s or something like that. Congressionally mandated task force looked at what's going on, and they found, that a large percentage of these people met criteria for what is then now is known as PTSD, that was adopted in 1980. And that these previous reports of no psychiatric casualties in Vietnam that were published were all misleading, to say the least, right? It was fanciful thinking. Like, you could actually get rid of the predictable outcome of war, which is not only people wounded by shrapnel and gunshots, but that you're going to have psychiatric casualties just by the fact that human beings are in a toxic environment like a battlefield.
Well, I think among those psychiatrists was Peter Bourne.
Oh, yeah. Do you know Peter Bourne?
I don't, but I have communicated with him, and I know his face, etc. And
what did he write about, though? What do you remember? Do you remember anything that stood out?
I can't recall, but he cited the low percentage of those who had problems, pretty much consistent with what you're saying.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, but he was the special assistant to the president, if you recall. Do you remember that?
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah, he was the special assistant to the president when my book, my first book, Stress Disorders Among Vietnam Veterans, was published.
Oh.
So Peter Boyne had arranged for a White House reception, helping to uplift everyone knowing about stress disorders among Vietnam veterans and be able to do something and change the course and all that sort of thing. But I didn't really know he had that kind of background in terms of publishing. But
Wow.
bless his heart, way to go. He did something right.
Go.
However, I think it was on our way to driving from Ohio to Washington, D.C. to attend this. And nothing had ever happened to me like that. I would have, my first book would have that much attention. However, he was, I don't know if fired, but he was relieved of his position because he had given a script to a staff member who then utilized it for emotion, pain pills, whatever it is, something relatively minor that everyone gets these days. And so he was out of a job in effect. So when we came into town, I mean, I had learned before we came into town, but they had quickly hustled up and had a special ceremony at the VA that, I forget his name, the VA director. I knew him. He was lost both legs. Why am I not remembering his name? There are about 70,000 people now that listen to this.
I know. I think I know who you're talking about too. I can't remember.
He was former.
He was in Congress, right?
Yeah, he was. I think he was governor of. He was attorney general, I think, in Georgia. But in any case, that was a bit of a mess, but it turned out fine. I mean, he was a Vietnam combat veteran, and certainly the president wasn't. So that worked out fine for all of us. I don't think anyone noticed the difference or really cared that much. I was glad it was over, obviously, but it was extraordinary that something that major would take place. And it was, in somewhat at least, associated with his status, you know, as a Vietnam vet, I would say. It was certainly embarrassing for him. But I do remember the National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study that you were talking about, that Congress mandated and that we all had to follow. I'm pretty sure I was part of the VA's, review committee. I didn't participate in the study.
Yeah.
But it was, I think, an extraordinary time, and I think we did a pretty good job. We reported, and I think it was in Stress Disorders. No, it was in another book, Strangers at Home, about the challenges that Vietnam vets faced at that point in time. But they definitely found that the PTSD rates, for example, men were 15.2, but the women's PTSD rate was 8.5. Now that was modified up for both men and women, thanks to Dornan's research. But I was surprised to read that when we were pulling the book together, because these days, when men and women complete these, women are always higher in PTSD rather than lower.
Yeah, I think I've seen some studies to that effect as well.
All of the studies, Mark, all of the studies say that.
Yeah.
I mean, the most recent, in the last 5 years, for example. But it makes sense, and that's consistent. My question is, why don't they then separate male version, female version, when there's such a significant difference just based on gender? I didn't understand that.
Yeah, I can't explain that either, but that's been called for. I know for decades that, women veterans have been clamoring for, having PTSD programs, that are specialized for women.
Right.
Because it's been, male dominated from the inception of the VA, that it's outdated in how we approach that. And
and things have improved significantly in many ways, I would say. But yeah, it was always that way. And the assertion was, well, it's because of the sexual assault, et cetera. And I can't disagree with that at all. But
yeah,
they're different than men. They respond differently. They're just very different beyond just the gender differences. but at
Yeah.
least in terms of combat-related PTSD. And for example, I published a couple of papers focusing on combat medics, and that men and women in that kind of context weren't that different, really.
Mm-hmm.
In the studies that we did in interviewing female medics, we found out that that's a way of getting along with the rest of them. Women have found that that's a way of being able to not only tolerate men, but being able to be accepted by them, by their changing and by the females changing and adapting to various kinds of maybe even sexist kind of behavior. I think that's it's waning, hopefully, but definitely been the case in the past.
I mean, you raised such really fascinating points, and it's just a whole, I think, area of research that has really been lagging is trying to explain some of the, like in this case, maybe a gender effect in the differential rates or what might, there's probably, I'm pretty sure there's been some studies done, but just
Yes.
not as widespread knowledge, and there's not as much attention at all really given to female veterans. Always been given a short stick, and the military now is becoming more and more. I don't know what the breakout is as far as gender goes, but it was still predominantly male, but I think it's like 30-40% maybe female now, and females are in combat positions as they often have been exposed to combat stress before, but
violence.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting to see where that goes, but certainly we're lagging for any type of being proactive in addressing what the needs are for female veterans, both on active duty and when they get out. That's something that neglected, like a lot of mental health, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And one of the things I wanted to ask you too is that we talked about this paradigm shifts, the trauma pension debates, and so on, and in the Second World War, they had to relearn the lesson that psychiatric casualties are a reality of modern warfare, irregardless of predisposition, weakness, and all that other stuff that they threw out there. But so they adopted that paradigm as a modified paradigm. They said acute stress reactions are normal and are due to the excessive stress on the brain, etc. And that anything longer than that is hysteria or predisposed. And that's when they adopted these phrases, combat exhaustion and combat fatigue or battle fatigue, is to kind of talk about that's universally accepted breakdown that's transient. You're tired, you're fatigued, you just need some rest and some recuperation, and you get your strength up and you go back to the fight. So that's all part of that frontline policy. But where PTSD comes into the trauma pension debates, that was adopted, as you said, 1980 after the Vietnam War, is that now there's a whole PTSD controversy. And that is PTSD a socially fictional disorder that was created mostly by anti-war psychiatrists that were trying to end the Vietnam War, but also end all wars by developing this construct called PTSD, which the critics, and there's many of them, and they're well published, and exist in our discipline of mental health, that they view PTSD as a pseudo factor, that it didn't exist before 1980, and it's done is it has a corrosive influence and led us down a bad path. But as somebody who's written about that, and you've written about Vietnam War syndrome, and what do you remember about how PTSD that came about, and the reasoning for why the American Psychiatric Association adopted that? You have anything around that?
I can tell you some of my experiences, especially with regard to the emergence of the nomenclature. I was invited, because I had done some research, I was invited to St. Louis to attend, and I couldn't stay the entire time, but I stayed for some of it. And it wasn't very interesting what was being discussed. A lot of technical terms. But the thing that I sensed was that it's just a matter of time that the evidence will be sufficient for them to say, oh, okay, well, yeah, you're right, this is it. It never happened. And my assumption would be that if we're able to show that combat veterans have these kinds of emotions and there's a variation among them, that there would be more acceptance. And that's before I met you and learned all I have about the broader context that I was not at all looking at. I was looking at, my people, and frankly, initially only at Marines. But yeah, that was always the mentality that I had, and the people that I worked with said, they'll figure it out, they'll come along, they will endorse, and I have to admit that's what mostly happened. I mean, there were very few meetings at any conference that I was aware of in which there was this skepticism that I guess in the early days when Society for Traumatic Stress Studies started, which was a long time ago. I can't remember exactly the year, 70s. Oh yeah, my youngest was born, 1985 is when it started. But it seemed like it was a growing, rather than the growing against PTSD or against trauma as a concept, it was growing the number of people that are interested, it appeared to me. But of course, I can go to the skeptics conference. I went to those that we thought knew best. But yeah, it was surprising to find that there was this robust group of people who didn't agree.
Who didn't agree? Do you recall what were some of the arguments that were made that who did not want to see PTSD be adopted?
No, I've never heard of any of them, actually.
Yeah.
But I think what you don't know is you've gotten beyond what I'm aware of and what most people are aware of, and into the nitty gritty. And you could see how the strategies for minimizing, don't talk about the symptoms of PTSD, blah, blah, blah.
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting because, with PTSD being adopted, and again, that came in 1980 with the DSM-3, that it seemed like to have gone full circle. So before we talked about 1864, and that was kind of the first medical legal paradigm in Europe and North America, that traumatic stress injuries, or at that time, traumatic neuroses, were legitimate injuries, right? So that became the accepted paradigm until the First World War. And that was, the day of infamy in September of 1916, right? Where they flipped that completely over and said, no, it's all hysteria. But yeah, but I'm just really curious to how even today there are still staunch critics of PTSD saying that there was nothing like that before 1980. So it's a completely revolutionized, invented construct when you had, and that's the arguments that I read from Ivy League people publishing books on trauma and PTS. And yet you have like folks like Oppenheim, and there's public record of these. It wasn't that hard to find it.
Yes.
That there were precursors of PTSD with different labels, obviously, but the symptoms were pretty much identical. And, there maybe, if anything, there were more broad symptoms earlier than PTSD. But how do these well-read, well-published authorities conclude that it's all a social fiction? I can't understand that.
There's always the minority. You have to let that go, Mark. There's always a minority of people who don't get, who refuse, have their arms folded, say la 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 la.
There may be some.
And that may be probably what accounts for why I don't know what they're saying or
just tune it out.
Yeah, I think there's I look at the literature every single day, and I don't see any evidence of their stature or their success.
Well, except in the military, my friend, because when I've confronted people in the military, and read things that people have published, and these are the leadership. Many of them have cite these authors that like Alan Young, and they cite them as evidence why PTSD is not real, and why it should be fought against, pushed back against, because it really just erodes and corrodes people's will and people's ability to be resilient, that type of thing. The whole Ben, I don't know if you've read Ben Shepard's War of Nerves.
No.
So his book, and Jones and Wesley also have Shell Shock to PTSD. These are some of the most cited authors as experts and authority figures on the whole history of traumatic stress and war stress in particular. And their views are very much along those lines, that PTSD was again, cultural fiction that was pushed by these anti-war psychiatrists and et cetera, and that there's no evidence really that supports that human beings have been afflicted by exposure to traumatic stress that warrants a diagnosis like PTSD. And I mean these are reviewed as some of the top, the best known authors in that topic, on that subject. So some people are reading that stuff, and it's kind of compelling when you read it, except until you peel back the Emperor's Clothes, you find out, oh my God, they're really being deceptive about the history. And there's a lot.
Selective, right?
Yeah.
Selective and deceptive. Yes.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Anyways, but you lived that part. I mean, I went to graduate school, and DSM, was introduced. So, it was, at that time it was in the DSM, so became something that they would teach on and so on. But you were living in that era where a lot of that controversy and debate about Vietnam War and about Vietnam Syndrome, and was that authentic or not, and then what led to PTSD. So
I was worried about far more important things than that.
Yeah.
Brouhaha. No, I mean, other vets killing themselves. I mean, that's an example. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, you started this conversation or a discussion about, how did we get started? Why are we so interested in, et cetera? And yeah, my feeling when I was in Vietnam, and when I was still I had 1 year left at Cherry Point, North Carolina, the air station there, the last year before I got out. And you already know this, it does something to you, being in combat, but more importantly, being around those who were in combat a lot, and who looked burned out, who looked traumatized, etc. That sticks with me, at least. I've written about this in terms of autobiographically. And it frustrates me that we have gone so far and then we go back.
Yes.
At the country, right?
Go.
And then we go back and we're exposed to this horrific experience, and we get it and we do something about it, but then we're not exposed to it. Then we forget about those people who are traumatized by that we don't have to look at anymore.
That's right.
That's the thing. It's been frustrating for me when a war ends, there is a retreat. You know this as well. Yeah. You mentioned.
Well, yes.
Yeah, keep going.
Well, we coined the term national reset to describe that pattern, is that after the war stopped and all the congressional and media attention comes off of the veterans and their families and the epidemics of suicide and all that stuff, right? That everything goes back to its baseline. It resets, and it's like hitting a reset on your computer. It washes out everything. All the memories gone. All the lessons learned from the previous war, as far as psychiatric lessons, are gone. And then you get into that, where that admiral told me at that field hospital I was at, and said, well, it all have to be reinvented again, have to be rediscovered. Why the hell are we doing that? But that's national reset. It worries the hell out of me because, it's already started with this generation as the leaders who believe in the value of mental health and the reality of war and the effects that has on the brain and our mind and spirit. They have retreated, they've gotten out, they've retired, they left the military. And so all that new wave of people in leadership are going to reinvent these policies this next major war that we'll be going into. And it'll all just be like a replay of what happened after the First World War, after the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, Persian Gulf War, and these two wars.
And there'll be two other guys doing this kind of podcast 30 years from now. Is that what I'm hearing?
Unfortunately, right. They'll be citing us like, okay, these people are talking about it. And not much has changed. And that's really it's very demoralizing to kind of bear witness to that. Once you're aware of the historical generational cycles that we go through, and in this whole idea about the national reset, is that it's very foreboding about what will come, because there's absolutely nothing in the political winds or in society that tells us that people are really going to really fight back and really take on stigma and everything else to put mental health on par with physical health. There's no political will. There's no economic will to do anything of that nature. So yeah, we'll see what happens, but I wouldn't be surprised at it.
But I will say though, meeting you and beginning to start working with you, whether it's a book or all of the dozens of articles that we've written, well, dozen, it's been great. I mean, my interest in war and in military was reawakened, thanks to you or because of you.
Well,
This is extraordinarily important stuff.
Yeah. Well, listen, so we're kind of at the end of our show today, and I wanted to give my contact information if anyone wants to provide us feedback, ask any questions, want to refute anything we said, or to correct anything, or just any feedback whatsoever will be welcome. And that you can reach me at mrussell, 2 S's, 2 L's, PhD @gmail.com. And that will be for Charles and I. So if you have something specific you want to give to Charles, you can send that through me, and I'll certainly pass that along. And until then, on an optimistic note, I hope everyone has a good week, and then we'll look forward to talking to you again in the next episode.